Hey everybody, this is Dan, the chess enthusiast. I've made my first video in a new series exploring chess openings, and today's opening is the center game, or the center opening. To start, I'm going to quote Alexander Alekhine in his characterization of the opening. He said, "It's clear that such a move by the queen at such an early stage of the game is unlikely to secure an advantage for white. However, black must play precisely so that his opponent doesn't mount an attack on the king's flank, or even the center, since from g3 the queen will be continuously putting pressure on black's castle position." What does Alekhine mean? Well, the white queen's ideal square is going to be g3, since from it she'll be putting a lot of pressure on black's castle position, and it's difficult for black to kick the queen from that square. How does the queen get to g3? One of the features of the center game is an early queen to d4 by white. This does result in the loss of a tempo, but in exchange, white has good center control, and if black doesn't play correctly, white is allowed to mount a strong attack rather quickly. Another characteristic to keep in mind while playing the center game is opposite side castling, with black castling short on the king side and white castling long on the queen side. In games with opposite side castling, what follows is a race to the king, and both players need to be tactically sharp to win. I'm making a video on this opening because I hardly ever see it in internet play, and while it's still seen occasionally at high levels of chess today, and enjoyed moderate popularity in the 20th century, I feel that one of the main advantages for white is the unfamiliarity many black players might have with the opening. Since the game that follows is tactically sharp, unfamiliarity in tactical waters is an asset for white and a liability for black. So first we'll go through the main line, and then we'll look at a couple of variations. So the game starts out with pawn to e4, pawn e5, pawn d4, e captures d4, then we have the early queen to d4. Knight out to c6, queen falls back to e3, and the main line continues with knight to f6. Now from here, it's best for white just to continue its development with knight to c3. If in this position white starts to get aggressive and maybe push the pawn to e5, that's not going to work out so well. From here, the knight can actually play to g4, and it's forking the pawn and the queen. So the queen has to play to e4, and after that we have d5. Pawn captures en passant with a discovered check from the queen, but the bishop just comes out to e6 and blocks that check. From here, white actually can play its bishop out to a6, and notice that this pawn is currently the only defender of the knight on c6. So if black captures the bishop on a6, white can capture the knight on c6. It'll be forking the king and the rook, and the queenside pawn structure for black will be weakened. So from here, black can capture the pawn on d6, and the bishop can capture the pawn on b7. But after we have queen to b4, this basically forces the queen exchange. And in this position, the knight on b4 is actually a very large menace. If it's allowed to get to c2, it will be forking the king and the rook. So in this position, white is basically forced to play knight to a3, and after black plays bishop to b8, white's just in a really kind of uncoordinated, messy position. The knight right now is married down to the defense of the c3 pawn. I'm sorry, the c2 pawn, and this bishop doesn't really have any squares, useful squares it can go to. The only safe squares right now are e4 and f3, and from those squares it's not really accomplishing a whole lot. So that's why in this position it's actually better for white not to push the pawn, and instead just to continue with development with the main line with knight to c3. So the main line continues with bishop down to d4. After that we have bishop to d2. This is breaking the pin that the bishop on b4 had on the knight, pinning the knight down to the king. Black castles short, white castles long, and then we have rook over to e8. This is putting a lot of pressure on the e4 pawn. From here, the bishop can play out to c4. The main line continues with pawn to d6, and then it finishes with white playing knight out to f3. So that's the end of the main line. Now we're just going to go and look at a couple of variations in the opening. So let's go back to the beginning. We have pawn to e4. We have this series of moves. From here, one variation that you might see instead of the knight coming out to f6, what you might see is bishop to b4, hitting the king with an immediate check. The knight can play to c3, blocking that check, and the knight on g can come to e7. If the knight on g comes to f6, then you basically just have a continuation of the main line that I just showed you, but with a changed up move order. From here, we have bishop to d2. Both sides can castle. Then we have pawn to d6. The queen is allowed to get to g3, which, remember, I said is her favorite square in this opening. And from this position, actually, it's best for the king to get off of the square it's on currently and go to h8. From this square, the pawn on g7 is pinned, and so if this bishop is allowed to get to h6, the only way to prevent mate will be to move the pawn forward, at which point the bishop will be able to capture the rook sitting here on f8. So we have king to h8, pawn to f4, pawn f5, and this is actually a very a very equal position for both sides. So that is one variation from the main line. Then if we go back, we have the continuation of the main line. Another variation that you might see after you have knight to c3 will be bishop to e7. The main line continued with bishop to b4 at this point, but black might opt to play just bishop to e7. After this, we can have bishop to c4. Black can castle bishop to d2, pawn to d6. White can castle long, like I said in the beginning. We have we have bishop to e6, and this basically forces the exchange of light square bishops. After this, the queen can play to h3. The black queen can play to d7. The knight on g can come to e2, and after we have pawn to e5, we have the possibility of a queen exchange. One thing that I do want to say is, well, this is the end of the variation that I just showed you. But one thing that I do want to say is that I feel that in this position it's probably not the best idea for black to initiate the queen exchange, because once the queen captures on h3 and the pawn on g2 recaptures, then you'll have a semi-open g file, and the rooks on the first rank are going to be able to make use of that and give a lot of headaches to this black king. So maybe in this position black doesn't want to initiate the queen exchange. So that's one more variation. And let's see, so continuing with the main line, one more variation that we'll look at is on move 8 from black, that is on black's 8th move. After we have bishop to c4, the main line continues with pawn to d6. An interesting variation, though, is if black plays knight to a5. This is kind of a tricky position for white to play, and he's going to have to play very, very carefully. If the bishop comes back to d3, then that's going to run in a couple of problems. After we have pawn to d5, well, remember that this pawn is pinned to the queen on e4 because of the rook sitting here on e8. So there's really no good answer that white has to this move. It can try something like queen to g3, but after that we just have bishop back to d6, attacking the queen with tempo, and there's not really a lot that the queen's going to be able to do. It's not going to be able to avoid being run around the board quite a lot. So one more thing that white might try in this position is after pawn to d5, the white player can try to push its pawn to e5, but from here pawn to d4 forks the queen and the knight, and after white saves the queen and moves it off to g3, black can save its knight and play to h5, and again there are just no good squares for the white queen to go to. The only safe square currently is f3 right here, and after white plays to that, then it will lose this knight sitting here on c3. So that's why move 8 from black in this opening, knight to a5, is an interesting move. However, there is one more variation that white can play that I feel is probably a little safer for white. After you see knight to a5, which you might play as white, is bishop back to e2. Now from here, it may seem like now now black can try to bust up the center and play an aggressive move like d5. But that actually really doesn't work out very well at all. In fact, it's a losing move. What can happen is we have pawn to e5. The pawn can come down to d4, forking the queen and the knight. But from here, the queen gets to g3, and notice that now that the pawn is sitting here on e5, bishop to d6 does nothing. So from here, black can try to get the material and capture on c3, but now we have a really sharp move, which is bishop to h6. This is threatening checkmate on g7, but it's also opening up a discovered attack on the queen from this rook sitting here on d1. Black might try something like pawn captures on b2 check, but after the king pulls off to b1, there's nothing that black's going to be able to do to prevent the loss of the queen or the game. So that's why playing d5 in this position after the bishop comes back to e2 in this variation is a bad idea. Instead, it's better for black to continue with pawn to d6, after which the queen will be able to get to g3. Black can bring its knight off of the rim of the board and play it back to c6, since all it was doing from here was attacking a bishop on c4, which is no longer there. Black does well to get it back into the game as soon as possible. And then we have bishop up to d3. So that's the end of that variation. And one last thing that I just want to show you is if on move 8, if in this position black starts to get a little greedy for material and tries to win the pawn sitting here on e4, it can win the pawn, but at what cost? So what might happen is the bishop can capture the knight on c3, bishop can recapture on c3, then the knight can come down and capture the pawn on e4. But after queen to f4, black's in kind of a shaky position. White is threatening checkmate. If it gets to f7, the only response that the king will have will be to fall back to h8, after which queen to g7 will be checkmate. And if black tries to prevent that by playing the rook over to f8 to protect the f7 pawn, well, it just drops the knight sitting here on e4. So from here, the best response actually is for black to play its knight back to f6. Then we have knight out to f3 from white, pawn to d6, and after knight to g5, again we have two attackers on this f7 square, and it's going to be somewhat difficult for black to defend this correctly. So yeah, so that is it for this video. Let's just bring it up to the end of the main line here. We have knight out to f3. So yeah, that's the end of the main line. So yeah, I encourage you all to experiment with this opening, see what you can come up with. I've played it a lot myself, and it really is tactically sharp. You really have to know what you're doing if you're going to play this opening. So maybe it's not best for beginners. But it is an exciting opening. It's dynamic. It can be a lot of fun, especially if you play correctly. So at this point, I encourage you all to follow the link that is on the screen. What I'm going to try to do is, after I make a video on some new opening, what I'm going to try to do is make a video exhibiting that opening at a high level of play from Grandmasters. So click on the link to see the Grandmaster game that I chose that features the center opening. So yeah, that's it for this video, and take care. Bye.